Hi class, this is Sir Alex Basco and welcome to our lesson in General Biology 2. This is lesson 9, which we are going to talk about the animal respiratory system. So what is the respiratory system? Basically, this is the system that we use in order for us to undergo gas exchange, which means this is the system that we use for us to breathe air, which contains the oxygen necessary for the cells to undergo cellular respiration. Without our ability to undergo gas exchange with our environment, because our body does not create oxygen, we have to be able to get oxygen from the environment into our body. Without this, it will be impossible for us to and our cells to undergo cellular respiration. Therefore, we cannot create the ATPs necessary for us to survive. And many organisms, such as humans, this gas exchange or this respiratory systems is what allows, like I've mentioned, the transfusion or the transfer of the oxygen from our lungs into our bloodstream, and from our bloodstream it transfers those oxygens into the cells. So which means that our respiratory system is actually working in tandem with our circulatory system. Circulatory system is the system in our body which enables the blood flow all over our body. Okay, so please do not get confused between circulatory system and respiratory system. Respiratory system again is what allows our body to be able to breathe air for the oxygen, as well as be able to release those carbon dioxide which our cells create during the cellular respiration. Remember, these carbon dioxides are waste product, which means we have to remove them from our body. The respiratory system is able to not only intake oxygen but also remove those carbon dioxide, and those oxygens are transferred all over our body via the circulatory system, which will actually be our next topic, which is lesson 10. So first, let's talk about the physics of breathing. How do we breathe? Well, when we breathe, we use various organs in our body, such as our lungs. The major part of our respiratory system is the nasal cavity, the trachea, and the lungs. But before we go into depth or into the detail on how this system works, let's talk about the physics on how we actually intake lungs. And the most important part of breathing, or not most important, but an important part of breathing, is the diaphragm. Why? Because diaphragm is actually what creates the negative pressure, which allows for the air and the oxygen to move from outside the environment into our body. So how does that happen? Well, remember that air actually will always travel from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. That's why if there is a storm, one thing, especially very strong storm, one of the things that you want to do is close your windows. Why? Because you don't want your roof to blow out of your house. No, the reason that yung mga bahay minsan nawawala yung mga bubong nila kasi during the storm there is a high pressure surrounding the house. No? And inside the house, there's much lesser pressure of air. So air will always travel from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So if there's a storm, what happens is that if your windows are open, that area, or there's a passageway for air to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And when that happens, when so much air will when your houses is blasted with the high pressure air due to this storm, those air would move from the storm papasok sa bahay nyo kung nakabukas yung mga windows ninyo or pintuan ninyo, and will create a bigger pressure inside your house, which will then blow out your roof pataas, no? Parang tatanggalin yung roof mo. That's what the reason, no? Yung physics kung bakit nawawala yung mga bubong natin, or I hope not yours, but yung mga bubong na maraming tao during a storm. The same concept can be applied sa lungs natin, but in very minute pressure, no? Because surrounding us is just 1 atmospheric pressure, or about 760 millimeters per millimeters mercury. I hope you guys remember your pressure from pre-6. So what the lungs need to do is for the diaphragm to descend. So ibig sabihin, this is our diaphragm. What the diaphragm does, it's a type of muscle, will actually go down and descends. And what it does is it inflates the lungs. No, when our diaphragm descends, our rib cage actually starts to open up, increasing the size and inflating the lungs. And when our lungs inflate, it creates a negative pressure. What that means is that there's now a low pressure, much lower pressure inside our lungs compared to the pressure in the environment, which then allows for the air to move from the environment, which has a high pressure, to an area of lower pressure, which is now inside our lungs. And that's how we actually breathe. No, there's that is the physics explanation on how we breathe. Another thing that you have to remember is when the air goes inside into our nasal cavity, into our trachea, that air actually starts to warm up so that it matches the temperature inside our body. So this is necessary because very cold air is actually not very good for our internal organs. So our body, especially yung mouth natin, this area right here, are all wet. They're filled with mucus, which helps warm up the air. Because if you guys remember from our thermoregulation, our body does not change. Hindi masyado nagbabago yung temperature natin. We are homeotherm. We are an endotherm homeotherm, which means our temperature or our body temperature is quite constant. So meaning we also want this air to be around the temperature of our body. So pag hinga natin, this air actually warms up, no? So that is the process of breathing. So now let's talk about the summary on what happens, and afterwards we are going to talk about in detail on what happens on the air that we breathe. So the first thing is that the oxygen will enter the lungs, no? So from the outside, the air will pass by the nasal cavity, papunta sa ating throat, sa ating trachea, and then hanggang makapasok siya sa lungs. And on that lungs, there are some organs, much smaller organs, which will allow the oxygen from the air that we breathe to pass from the lungs into the capillaries or into the blood vessels of our body. So magmamove si oxygen from the lungs, magkukross siya sa tissues ni lungs, and papasok siya sa ating bloodstream. And that's when the circulatory system enters, which then helps travel this oxygenated air throughout our body into our organs and tissues. And then oxygen is then exchanged with CO2 also along the lungs, no? Which then, when the CO2 enters the bloodstream, it travels back to the lungs, and then the CO2 moves from the blood vessels papunta kay lungs, and then the lungs will expire. Expiration is another term for exhalation, and that's how we exhale carbon dioxide, or yung carbon dioxide, which is the waste product of the cellular respiration. So this is the summary of what is happening in the respiratory system. Now let's take a look individually or much more in detail kung ano yung nangyayari, no? First, like we've mentioned, we have to create the negative pressure via our diaphragm. So when our diaphragm descends, as you can see here, this is our diaphragm here. It descends, and our thoracic cage, our ribs, expands, which creates a bigger, or which inflates our lungs and creates a negative pressure. Then the oxygen, which is the yellow color right there, enters our lungs. And what happens is that the air enters first the nasal cavity, and in here alongside the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea, it warms the air, no? So the air enters the nasal cavity, it passes the pharynx, which is our throat, and our larynx, which are the vocal cords, and makes its way into the trachea. This is the trachea. This is the main passageway or the main duct that connects our throat and our larynx and our nasal cavity into the lungs. So pagpasok ni air and then pumunta na siya kay trachea, the trachea actually bisects into two directions called the primary bronchi. So it either goes into the left bronchi or into the right bronchi, no? So that is the primary bronchi. So the air passes from the primary bronchi, which is either left or right, and then as it passes from the bronchi, which is the separated branch right here, it enters into a much more smaller branches called the bronchioles. Okay, so from the bronchi, it enters the bronchioles until it arrives at the terminal respiratory bronchioles, where we are going to find the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs is an area at the terminal of our bronchioles which contains about 20 to 30 alveoli. Alveoli are these small, you can think of this as a small structures right here, and all of them are found inside an alveolar sacs. And these alveoli are actually covered with capillaries, no? And this is where the gas exchange happens. These alveoli are covered and in direct contact with the capillaries of our circulatory system. And when the air travels, the oxygen travels, as you can see this O2 right here, and enters our alveolar or alveoli, then via their physical contact and because of the thin membrane of our capillaries, gas or the O2 molecules will then diffuse from the alveoli papasok din sa mga capillaries. That's how the gas exchange occurs. And then the oxygen diffuses from the alveoli papunta sa capillaries and then into the bloodstream, wherein our circulatory system will pump the blood papunta sa ating mga extremities, sa ating mga organs and tissues in order to oxygenate our body, to provide the oxygen for our cells, no? And this area right here, because of there's actually a lot of them. There's a lot of alveoli in our lungs. And in reality, kahit maliit yung katawan natin, the surface area of these alveoli, which has a contact around our capillaries, is actually almost as big as half the tennis court. So ganun kalaki yung surface area, which allows for the diffusion of oxygen into our body. So ibig sabihin, malaki yung surface area na nagkakaroon ng diffusion, no? And this is necessary because our body needs tons of oxygen, without which our cellular respiration will have a problem, and we will have difficulty creating ATPs for our survivability. What happens then is the CO2 that our cells in our body, yung mga waste product, is also traveling the unoxygenated blood, no? And this unoxygenated blood contains CO2 along this area as well. Magdi-diffuse si oxygen or si carbon dioxide. So habang papasok si CO2 papasok sa bloodstream or sa ating capillaries, from capillaries to alveoli, papasok naman si carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide, this red color right here, will then be expelled kasi si diaphragm tataas na siya. Ibig sabihin yung ating pressure, we won't have any more pressure, no? We won't have that negative pressure, and when that negative pressure is no more, it allows the expiration, or it allows for the carbon dioxide to be expelled or exhaled out of our body. So this is how the respiratory system works in our body. So it's very simple, but when you go to college, especially when you practice become a doctor, this is actually very simple. There's more process that we are not going to discuss because it's not within our capacity yet to understand all of these, and this is just grade 12, no? But if you're interested, when you go to college, there's so much more that you will learn about the process of respiratory as well as the circulatory system. So this is the whole process of respiratory system, but this is mostly for mammals. there are different other systems, or there are other respiratory system which exist on various animals. So let's look at them, no? So first is direct diffusion. Direct diffusion is another type of gas exchange, but this mostly happens for smaller multicellular organisms. Those organisms that are about less than 1 millimeter in diameter. So sobrang maliliit lang sila. And because they're small, their body is enough to provide oxygen for the entirety of their body via direct diffusion. So, ibig sabihin, dun sa surface area ng katawan nila, mostly a lot of them are actually quite wet, which allows for the oxygen to dissolve onto their surface and then will be absorbed into their body. So, that is the direct diffusion. Another thing is skin and gills. A lot of earthworms and amphibians uses their skin as their respiratory organs. Just below the surface of their skin, they have their yung blood vessels nila doon, no? So instead of having the quite complex respiratory system that we have, in which we have to create the negative pressure, inhale air, ang mga earthworm and amphibians actually uses their skin. Kumbaga, kapag nahanginan sila, yung mga oxygen na nandun sa air na naghahangin sa kanila, it diffuses inside their body. And then the respiratory system that is found, or the circulatory system that is found just right below the surface of their skin, catches those oxygen, which then is used to oxygenate the cells throughout their body. Some naman, especially for those organisms that are living in the water or under the water, no, they have gills. Gills are tools that are quite folded, no, usually found among animals such as crustaceans and fishes. What it does is it actually exposes a lot of the tubular network, or the circulatory system on their gills. What happens is that oxygen, there's actually a smaller portion of oxygen dissolve into the water. No, there's actually more oxygen dissolved sa air compared to water. So in order for a lot of fishes to get enough oxygen, their gills are created in such a way that increases the surface area, which then allows for the water to pass onto the gills. And when water passes onto the gills, yung mga oxygen that is dissolved into the water actually diffuses from the water papasok dun sa gills, and from the gills, that's where they get the oxygen they need in order for them to undergo cellular, or provide the oxygen for their cells, for their body to undergo cellular respiration and create ATPs. So those are another way of gas exchange for different animals. And then there's another unique one called the tracheal system, which exists sa mga insects. Insects, yung gas exchange system nila, respiratory system nila, is actually different, or is actually independent from their circulatory system, which is unlike from us humans and other animals like the earthworms, amphibians, and even those with gills. No, we require the circulatory system to transfer these oxygen sa mga cells ng katawan natin. Insects, on the other hand, has holes in their body called spiracles, which are found along the thorax, or yun sa may likuran nila, along their spinal cord, you can think of it that way, and in their abdomen. And then yung mga butas nito, or this opening, this allows the diffusion or pagpasok ng oxygen. So it's actually a direct yung pagpasok mismo ng oxygen dun sa tracheal system nila. And that tracheal system is what transfers the oxygen throughout their body in order to oxygenate these cells in their body. Meaning they do not need their circulatory system to transfer these oxygen. So the tracheal system will do it on its own. Okay, and lastly, we have the mammalian system, which we belong to, which is what we just discussed. Now we have the inhalation and the expiration, and we have the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and the lungs that helps us breathe and helps us, and the circulatory system, which will help us transfer those oxygens throughout the body. So these are some of the examples of gas exchange found in various animals. And lastly, there is a protective mechanism in our respiratory system. The air that we breathe contains a lot of particulate matter. This could be bacteria, this could be dust, no, this could be matters that may damage our respiratory system. So what happens is that a lot of these particulate are trapped in hairs, which we usually call cilia, and type of mucus. So the reason na may buhok yung ilong natin or cilia is because it traps those bacteria and dust. So you see right now, maraming tao yung nag-aalis ng buhok sa ilong nila. You seen those beauty products that does that? It doesn't make sense because the cilia on your hair is actually helping you protect your respiratory system from dust, bacteria, dirt, and any particulate matter that can actually damage your respiratory system. So if you are someone that is using those beauty products, I suggest please stop using them. Kung medyo mahaba man yung buhok sa ilong natin, we can trim it, but never use those parang glue na you stick on your nose and then you pull out to remove all those hair on your body. It is not necessary because the cilia, those hairs that is found on your nose, is what's protecting you from those dust and dirt. Okay? So when kapag sobrang pollutant, no? Imagine sobrang madust or sobrang marumi yung binibreathe natin na air, that those particulate matters passed from the nasal cavity and nakapasok mismo sila do sa trachea natin. Do not worry because our trachea also has mucus and hairs. No, they have this mucus and hair. This mucus is created by a substance called mucin, which is released by the mucus cell, no? And what happens is that yung mga yung nakapass sa ating nasal cavity, those particulate matters are trapped along our trachea and along our bronchi, no, along our bronchioles, and the cilia are actually moving. So they're brushing those particulate pataas and those mucus as well. So nangyayari as those cilia is pushing those particulate pataas, it actually leads them into our esophagus in order for us just to swallow, or minsan pwede nyo silang idura, no? So that is how our body is protecting this respiratory system, because if this respiratory system is damaged, it is very difficult for you to breathe. You would undergo iron lung, such as that, no? Sobrang hirap, no? And this is what the COVID-19 then, that actually destroys, no, your circulatory system. Kaya during the COVID pandemic, marami naghahanap ng oxygen kasi nahihirapan silang huminga because the COVID-19 also targets your respiratory system. And one thing also is, if you are smoking, I'm not judging you. You have the rights to smoke, especially if you are already of age. But remember, it's just a warning that smoking actually also damages respiratory system. When you smoke, a lot of tar builds up around your nasal cavity and around your trachea. And this tar can actually hardens the mucus and damage and paralyze your cilia. So, kung mapapansin ninyo, marami sa mga smoker has a lot of respiratory issues. The reason for that is because those buildup of tar and nicotine sa katawan natin destroy this very important protective system in our body, which then does not allow for our body to trap this particulate matter. Kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng lung cancer, nagkakaroon tayo ng asthma, and so on and so forth. So just a warning, if you are a smoker, please know the risk and understand what you are damaging sa katawan natin, no? Again, if I were you, I would stop. I encourage you to stop, but again, the choice is on to you. But this is how our body protects our respiratory system against the particulate matter para hindi tayo magkaroon ng maraming problema. So this is the respiratory system of our body. If you guys have any question, please do not hesitate to message me. Also, our next discussion will move on to the circulatory system, which is after natin ma-inhale yung oxygen, how does the body transfers those oxygen throughout our body so that the cell can get them and our cell can undergo cellular respiration. So that is all for today. Thank you so much, and may you guys have a great day.